The letter fell from Sadie Kingsley's hands before she even finished reading it. She did not pick it up. She stood in the middle of Clement Bailey's dusty front yard, the Arizona sun hammering the back of her neck, her fingers gone cold despite the heat, and she stared at the crumpled paper where it had landed in the red dirt. Around her, the world kept moving as it always did, indifferent and relentless. A horse stamped in the paddock. A crow called from the fence post. Somewhere behind her, she heard the squeak of the porch door opening, heard the slow, deliberate creak of boots on old wood, heard them stop. She did not turn around. She had trained herself not to need anyone to witness her pain. She had practiced it for 3 years, this art of standing very still while something inside her broke apart. She had done it at her husband's funeral. She had done it when the bank took the farm. She had done it every single morning since she arrived in Beaumont Flats, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1884, when she realized that starting over was just another word for surviving what you had already lost. She was very, very good at being quiet about it. What she was not prepared for was Clement Bailey doing nothing at all. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not say her name. He walked down the 2 porch steps, crossed the yard, and stopped beside her. He looked down at the fallen letter for one moment, then looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him simply reach out and set his hand very gently over hers where they hung at her sides. Not gripping, not pulling, just there. That was all it took. Sadie Kingsley, who had not cried in front of another living soul in 3 years, came completely undone. She had worn her grief so quietly for so long that his noticing it without words undid her completely, and the sound that came out of her was not pretty or dignified. It was ragged and raw and old, the kind of sound that had been sealed inside a person far too long, and she pressed the back of her free hand against her mouth as if she could hold the rest of it in, but she could not. She could not, and Clement Bailey did not move away. He turned toward her and pulled her gently against his chest, and held her in the middle of that sun-blazed yard, while she cried for everything she had lost, and everything she had pretended not to lose, and everything she had been too proud and too afraid and too broken to ask for. She had not expected any of this when she had first stepped off the southbound stage in Beaumont Flats 4 months earlier, carrying 1 carpet bag, 1 battered trunk, and a secret dark enough to have driven her 300 miles from the life she had once known in Kansas. She had not expected any of this at all. Beaumont Flats in the spring of 1884 was a town that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. It sat in the wide red valley between 2 sets of low mesa ridges, and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway had laid track 18 miles to the north, close enough to make the town useful but far enough away to give it a slightly left-behind feeling, as though the real world had brushed past it in the night without stopping. There was a main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a land office, a hotel called the Desert Star, a saloon called the Red Thread, and a small white church that the traveling preacher visited once a month. There were 2 streets of houses running perpendicular to the main road, with more scattered across the surrounding land, ranches and homesteads at various distances, each one holding a different version of the same hard dream. Sadie arrived on the afternoon stage with dust in her hair and a name written in her pocket on a folded piece of paper. The name was Clement Bailey, and the job was housekeeper. She had seen the advertisement placed through the Beaumont Flats land office, passed along through a network of church women in Wichita who concerned themselves with placing respectable widows in respectable employment. The advertisement had said simply that a rancher of steady character required a housekeeper of steady character for his property outside of town, a house of 5 rooms, no livestock work expected, wages honest, references required. Sadie had provided references. She had not provided the full truth of why she had left Wichita, which was the only secret she would allow herself, and even that secret was not a sin so much as it was a wound. She had been 30 years old when she came to Beaumont Flats. She had been married once, to a man named Thomas Kingsley, who had been kind and hardworking and dead for 3 years from a fever that took him in 9 days in the autumn of 1881. They had been married 4 years, and she had loved him truly, and she had buried him in the church cemetery in Wichita. And then she had spent the following 3 years doing what a woman alone in that era had to do, which was work herself nearly invisible to stay alive, and to stay out of the debt and desperation that circled widows like crows. She had taken in sewing. She had worked in a boarding house kitchen. She had done the kind of labor that left your hands cracked and your back aching, and your pride reduced to something you could only tend to in private, late at night, when no one was watching. And she had been quiet about all of it, because the alternative was to ask for help, and asking for help meant explaining how badly things had gone, and explaining that meant taking off the armor she had built around herself piece by piece, and she did not know if she could survive being that exposed. The other reason she had left Wichita was a man named Gerald Pryor, who was the brother of a local businessman, and who had decided that Sadie's widowhood made her available for a kind of attention she had not invited and did not want. He had not hurt her, not in the way that left marks, but he had made it clear in the persistent, entitled way of certain men that her situation made her dependent on his goodwill, and that his goodwill had a price. When she had gone to the church women for help, they had been kind, and one of them had handed her the advertisement for Beaumont Flats, and she had left inside of a week. That was the secret, that she had run. That she was, in some fundamental way, starting over because she had been too afraid to stand and fight. She told none of this to Clement Bailey when she arrived at his ranch. He was 29 years old, and he had been running the Bailey spread since the age of 23, when his father had died of a heart attack while mending fence on the north pasture. He had a younger sister, Nell, who had married a man in Socorro 2 years earlier and who wrote twice a month and worried constantly. He had 3 ranch hands, an excellent horse named Copperhead, and what appeared to be a severe and long-standing allergy to unnecessary conversation. He was not rude. Sadie had been prepared for rude. She had heard stories about Western men, about their curtness, their dismissiveness, their tendency to treat a woman hired to cook and clean as something slightly less significant than a good saddle. Clement Bailey was not like that. He was simply very quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than hostile, as though he had made a considered decision at some point in his life to keep his words for things that mattered. He showed her the house. He told her the wages, which were as advertised, honest and fair. He showed her which room would be hers at the back of the house, with a window that looked out over a small vegetable garden, and beyond it the open red desert stretching toward the mesa ridges. He told her he ate breakfast at 6:30 and supper at 6 in the evening. He told her the names of the 3 ranch hands, Buck, Hector, and young Will, who was 17 and who ate like a man twice his size. He told her that the root cellar key hung on a hook by the back door, and that the well pump needed 2 good primes before it ran clean. And then he went back outside, and that was essentially the whole of their first conversation. Sadie stood in the kitchen of the Bailey Ranch house and felt something settle in her that she had not expected. Not happiness exactly, more like the sensation of a room that had been too loud going quiet. She had been braced for something difficult, and instead she had found something that was simply straightforward, and in her current condition, straightforward felt close to a gift. She cooked supper that first night with the ingredients she found in the larder, a proper beef and vegetable stew that she made from scratch, with biscuits, and when she set it on the table and the 4 men came in from their work and Buck whistled low under his breath, and Will immediately began serving himself a second helping before he had finished the first, she felt something flicker in her chest that was dangerously close to warmth. Clement sat at the head of the table. He tasted the stew. He said nothing for a moment, and then he looked down the table toward where she stood by the stove and said, "That is very good." 2 sentences. The first a complete sentence. The second a complete sentence. That was Clement Bailey's version of an enthusiastic reception, and somehow, inexplicably, Sadie found it more encouraging than any amount of effusive praise would have been. She had been at the Bailey Ranch for 2 weeks before she realized that he noticed things. It was a small thing at first. She had a habit, developed during the boarding house years, of rubbing the base of her left thumb with the pad of her right index finger when she was anxious or tired or holding something in. It was the kind of gesture a person does without knowing they do it, invisible to themselves, visible only to someone paying close attention. She was standing at the kitchen sink one evening, working through the supper dishes, and she was thinking about something that had come back to her that day, a memory of Thomas, of a specific afternoon in the last autumn before he got sick, when they had driven the wagon out to look at a piece of land they had been thinking about buying. The memory had arrived without warning, the way they did, and she had folded it back up and gone on working, but her thumb had been rubbing. When she turned from the sink, Clement was standing in the kitchen doorway. He had been about to ask something. She could tell by the way he had his mouth half open, but when he saw her face he stopped. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face again. He closed his mouth. He turned and walked back to the parlor. He did not ask what was wrong. At the time, she was simply grateful for it. Later, she would understand that what he was doing was not failing to ask. He was choosing not to press. He was giving her the room to carry whatever she was carrying without demanding that she perform an explanation for him. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone had done for her in years, and he had done it by doing nothing, and she did not fully recognize it for what it was for several more weeks. By the end of April, she had settled into the rhythms of the ranch house as though she had always been there. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew that Clement liked his coffee black and very strong, and that he would eat almost anything she put in front of him but went quietly and particularly pleased when she made cornbread. She knew that he read in the evenings, whatever he could get from the town's small lending collection at the general store, history mostly, and occasionally the kind of practical manuals that men who run working ranches need, on soil and livestock, and the particulars of water rights. She knew that he got up before dawn and went out to the paddock alone for half an hour before the hands arrived, and that this was his private time in the way that her early mornings in the kitchen were hers. She made sure the coffee was ready before he came back in. He made sure never to come back in before she was ready. Neither of them discussed this arrangement. It had simply happened, the way the best arrangements between people do. The three ranch hands had opinions about all of this, of course. Buck was a weathered man of 40-something who had worked for the Bailey family since before Clement's father died, and who expressed his opinions through a series of meaningful silences and slightly raised eyebrows that Sadie was learning to read with increasing accuracy. Hector was 26, the son of a Mexican vaquero who had worked cattle across half the territory, and he was good-natured and straightforward and said directly to Sadie at the end of her first month, "You are the best cook who has ever been in that kitchen, and I say that including Clement's mother, God rest her, so please do not leave." Young Will simply stared at her food with an expression of pure reverent devotion and said very little else. None of them said anything directly about Clement, but Buck's eyebrows were doing considerable work in that direction, and Sadie chose to ignore them. She could not afford to think about Clement Bailey in any way that was not professional and practical. She was his housekeeper. She was a widow with no resources and a somewhat precarious situation. She was 300 miles from the only life she had known, and she was here because she had needed to run from something, and she was still, if she was being honest with herself, running. A person in that position did not have the luxury of feelings that complicated matters. She told herself this on the morning in early May when she went out to hang the laundry and found him already there, fixing the line post that had come loose, and he glanced up at her and said nothing, but simply moved aside to give her room to work, and they worked together in companionable silence for 20 minutes, and at the end of it, she had to go inside and stand very still at the kitchen sink for a moment before she could continue her day. Nothing had happened. He had fixed a fence post and she had hung sheets and they had not even spoken, but something about the quiet ease of it, the way it felt entirely natural and entirely right, had hit her somewhere she was not prepared for. She was being foolish, she told herself. She was lonely and tired and she had been without warmth for a very long time, and the first steady, decent man who crossed her path was going to seem remarkable simply for being what he was. That was loneliness speaking, not sense. May became June. The heat arrived properly, the dry Arizona heat that pressed down like a hand, and the ranch work intensified as the summer range preparation began. Clement was outside from before dawn until well after dark some nights, and Sadie found herself keeping supper warm long past the regular hour, and leaving it covered on the back of the stove, and he would come in, dusty and tired, and find it, and eat it, and she would hear him washing up at the basin in the back room, and then the house would go quiet for the night. One evening in the second week of June, she was sitting at the kitchen table after supper, mending a tear in one of Buck's work shirts by lamplight, and Clement came in from the evening check of the herd. He washed up. He came into the kitchen for the covered plate she had left and sat down across the table from her, which he did not usually do. He usually ate alone when he came in late. He ate slowly, the way a tired man does, and she sewed, and neither of them said anything for quite a long time. Then he said, "Where did you come from before this?" She looked up. It was an ordinary question, a simple question. "Wichita," she said. "Before that, a farm in central Kansas where I grew up." He nodded. He ate another forkful. Then he said, "You had a husband." It was not a question exactly, or it was, but it was asked very gently in the way of a person who already knows the answer and is asking because they want to hear her speak it rather than because they need the information. "Yes," she said. "Thomas. He died in the fall of 1881, a fever." A pause. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it the way people sometimes say it and sometimes do not, as though he actually was. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it was late and she was tired and the lamplight made everything feel slightly less defended, she said, "He was a good man. There are not always a lot of those." He looked at her then directly and he said, "No, there are not." They looked at each other across the kitchen table for a moment that lasted longer than she had planned, and then she looked back down at her sewing, and he finished his supper, and that was all. But she lay awake that night for an hour longer than usual, and the thing she kept thinking about was not what had been said but what had been behind it, the sense that he had understood something she had not fully articulated, that he had heard the words she had not said as clearly as the ones she had. She was very, very careful after that. She had built her quiet so carefully. The grief over Thomas, the shame of the running from Wichita, the bone-deep exhaustion of 3 years of survival by her own 2 hands, all of it stacked and pressed and held in place by the precise, practiced discipline of a woman who knows that if she lets one piece slip, the whole structure comes down. She had learned to operate from behind that discipline, the way a person learns to walk with an injury, adjusting the gait until the compensation becomes second nature, and you almost forget that anything is wrong. What she had not accounted for was a man who was quiet enough himself to notice the particular shape of her quiet. In July, a letter came from Wichita. It was from one of the church women, a Mrs. Halloran, who wrote to say that Gerald Pryor had come asking after Sadie's whereabouts, and that Mrs. Halloran had not told him where Sadie had gone, and that she hoped Sadie was well and safe. The letter was kind. It was also terrifying because it confirmed the thing Sadie had been half afraid of, that her departure had not actually been the end of it. She read the letter in her room. She folded it and put it in the bottom of her trunk. She went about her day. She cooked breakfast, washed up, put the beans on to soak for supper, aired the spare bedroom, swept the porch. She was fine. She was perfectly fine. She did not think about what it would mean if Gerald Pryor came to Beaumont Flats. She did not think about the fact that he was the kind of man who had resources and connections, and the sense of entitlement that comes from never having been told no by anyone with the power to enforce it. She did not think about any of that, because If she let herself think about it, she would not be able to stop. It was 2 days later that Clement came home from town with a second letter for her, which had arrived at the post office at the general store. He handed it to her with a glance that she felt on her skin before she had even turned around to take it. She waited until he had gone back outside before she opened it. This letter was from Gerald Pryor himself. It was written in the smooth, controlled hand of a man who considered himself civilized and persuasive, and it said that he had heard she was in the New Mexico territory, that he was a man of some traveling in his business, and that he found himself often in the Southwest, that he hoped she was well, and that if she was ever in any difficulty, as a widow alone in new territory might be, he would be glad to assist her in any number of ways, and that he expected to be passing through the Beaumont Flats area before the summer was out. It was not a threat. It was more sophisticated than a threat. It was the written version of that slow, patient pressure he had always applied, the kind that said, "I am always here, I am always watching, and one day you will run out of options, and then you will come to me." That was the letter that fell from her hands in the yard. She had been standing at the fence post nearest the house, having walked outside because she needed air after reading it, and that was when she heard the porch door and the boots on the steps, and turned to find Clement stopping beside her and looking at her face and reaching out to take her hand. And everything she had been holding for 3 years came apart in the middle of that sun-blazed yard. She cried until there was nothing left to cry, which took longer than she would have expected, longer and harder, and through all of it Clement Bailey stood with her in the yard and held her, not with the awkward padding of a man who wanted the crying to stop, but with the steady, solid presence of a man who understood that what was happening was necessary, and that his job in this moment was simply not to leave. When the storm finally passed, she pulled back from him. She was mortified. She could feel it rising over the grief, the hot flush of humiliation. She had just completely fallen apart in front of the man who employed her. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and kept her eyes down. "I apologize," she said. "I do not know what came over me. I am sorry. That was Sadie." He said her name for the first time just like that, and it stopped her. "Pick up the letter." She looked at him. "If you want to," he said, "or leave it there. But if you pick it up, I would like you to tell me what it says. Only if you want to." She stared at the letter in the dirt for a long moment. She thought about what she had been doing for 3 years. She thought about the weight of it. She thought about his hand on hers. She bent down and picked up the letter. She handed it to him. He read it. His face did not change much while he read it, but there was a stillness that came over him that was different from his ordinary stillness, a focused, careful kind, the kind that animals get when something has crossed into their territory. He folded the letter and held it and said, "When did you leave Wichita?" "March," she said. "This spring. And he followed you here." "I do not know how. I was careful." "Men like this," he said, and he paused, and she could see him choosing words with the precision he always used, "do not usually follow women for reasonable purposes." "No," she said, "they do not." He looked at her. How dangerous is he? She thought about that carefully. "He has not been violent," she said. "He is worse than violent in some ways. He is connected and patient, and he uses circumstance like a weapon. He made it clear in Wichita that my situation made me vulnerable and that he was willing to wait until that vulnerability became desperation." Clement nodded slowly. He looked out toward the road that led to town. "You are not vulnerable here," he said. She looked at him. "You have a job and a wage," he said, and he was very deliberate about it, "and you are on Bailey land. I want you to know that." It was not a declaration. It was not romance. It was a plain-spoken statement of a practical kind, and yet she felt it land somewhere deep and certain, the way true things land. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I mean it as a fact." He wrote back to Gerald Pryor that same evening. He did not tell Sadie exactly what the letter said, only that he had made it clear that Mrs. Kingsley was employed on Bailey land, and that visitors who arrived uninvited with unspecified purposes were not welcome in any form. He handed her the sealed letter and said, I thought you should decide whether to send it." She held it for a moment. She turned it over in her hands. She sent it. The response came 3 weeks later and was brief and cool, saying only that Mr. Pryor wished Mrs. Kingsley well in her new position and had no wish to cause any trouble. It was a retreat dressed up as courtesy, and both of them knew it for what it was. It was also, Sadie thought, with something that felt very much like relief breaking open in her chest, the first time in 3 years that someone had stood beside her in a fight she had been trying to fight alone. Something shifted between them after that. It was subtle and it was slow, because they were both people who moved slowly with important things. But it was real. She could feel it in the way he had started to look at her when he thought she was not watching, which she knew because she had started to look at him the same way. She could feel it in the way their conversations at the kitchen table had stretched from a few sentences to half an hour. An hour, the lamp burning low while they talked about things that mattered to them. His plans for the ranch, his father's history with this land, her years in Kansas before everything changed. He told her about his father, a man named James Bailey who had come out to the territory in 1868 with $200 and a belief in himself that Clement clearly felt was either great courage or great stubbornness, and had not yet determined which. He told her about his mother, who had died when Clement was 14 from complications following his sister Nell's birth, and who he remembered most clearly as a presence rather than specifics, a quality of warmth in the house that had gone out when she died, and that he had been trying to get back into the structure of the place ever since without quite knowing that was what he was doing. He said that last part quietly, looking at his coffee, and Sadie thought that it was the most personal thing she had ever heard him say, and she understood that he knew it too. She told him about Thomas, not just the fact of him but the person of him. The specific way Thomas had laughed at himself when things went wrong on the farm, the way he could calm a frightened horse by just standing near it and breathing slowly, the way he had held her hand on the last night before the fever took him the rest of the way down, as though he was the one doing the comforting instead of the other way around. She told him that she had not talked about Thomas to anyone in a very long time, that it had felt for a while as though speaking about him would use him up, diminish him somehow, and that she had kept him inside like a pressed flower in a Bible, protected and preserved. Clement listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He sounds like someone worth missing." She felt her throat tighten. "Yes," she said, "he was." "Missing someone," Clement said slowly, "doesn't mean you have to stay where the missing takes you." She looked at him carefully because that was not a simple observation. That was a deliberate thing to say, chosen with the precision he always used, and it meant something more than it appeared to on the surface. "No," she said, "I suppose it does not." He looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes that saw more than he ever said, and then he picked up his coffee cup and said nothing else, and somehow that was enough for the evening. August came and the heat was tremendous and the territory baked like clay in a kiln. The ranch work was relentless, and Sadie found herself taking on things she had not been hired to do, helping Hector mend fencing near the house when she had a free afternoon, delivering water to the hands when they were working close enough, learning the small operations of the place with a natural ease that surprised her. She had grown up on a farm. She knew work. And there was something about being useful in a tangible way, after years of boarding housework that had always felt temporary and borrowed, that fed something in her she had been rationing for too long. Buck watched all of this with his raised eyebrows at full deployment and said nothing. Hector said, "You know, most housekeepers do not help with the fencing," and she said, "Most housekeepers did not grow up mending their father's fence either." And Hector laughed his big open laugh, and that was the end of that. Will, who was 17 and earnest and still in the process of constructing his understanding of the world, said to her one afternoon with the directness of the very young, "Mr. Bailey likes you, you know." Sadie looked at him. "I work for Mr. Bailey," she said. "Yes, ma'am," said Will, with a look that suggested he found the distinction less clarifying than she had intended. Clement's sister Nell arrived at the end of August. Nell Bailey, now Nell Ramirez, was 24 years old and possessed of a personality that was the exact photographic negative of her brother's. Where Clement spoke carefully and seldom, Nell spoke enthusiastically and continuously. Where Clement moved through a room with a minimum of fuss, Nell moved through a room like weather, full of energy and opinion. She arrived on the afternoon stage from Socorro with her husband Diego, who was a quiet, kind man who smiled a great deal and seemed entirely comfortable with the domestic storm front that was his wife. She took one look at the state of the ranch house, which was substantially cleaner and more organized than it had been, and then one look at Sadie, and then one look at Clement, and her eyebrows did exactly what Buck's eyebrows did, except with considerably more emphasis and less discretion. She cornered Sadie in the kitchen on the first morning of their visit while Clement and Diego were out looking at the north pasture fence. She poured herself coffee, sat down, and said, "So, tell me everything." Sadie, who was not without her own form of deflection, said, "There is very little to tell. I cook and keep house, and your brother is a very reasonable employer." Nell looked at her with bright, dark eyes. "Clement has never been very reasonable about anything in his life," she said. "Practical, yes. Stubborn, absolutely. Fair, mostly. But reasonable makes him sound manageable, and he is not manageable. He is very easy to work for," Sadie said. "He set up that letter for you," Nell said, and Sadie went still. "He wrote to me about it, about the man from Wichita." Sadie turned from the stove slowly. "He wrote to you about that?" "He asks my opinion on things," Nell said, and her voice had lost its teasing edge and become something more direct and fond. "He always has. He does not like to make mistakes with people." He wanted to know if he had handled it correctly. Sadie felt something squeeze in her chest. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that writing the letter and telling you that you were not vulnerable on Bailey land was exactly right," Nell said. "And I told him that if he had any sense at all, which he does, he would stop treating the situation as merely professional." A long silence. "Nell," Sadie said carefully. "I know," Nell said. "I know it is not my business, and I know you have history that is painful, and I know Clement is not easy to read, because he keeps everything so close. But I also know my brother, and I have not seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you since," she stopped. "Since before our father died, since before he took on everything alone." She set down her cup. "He has been alone for a very long time." Sadie said nothing. She turned back to the stove and did things with the skillet that did not need doing. "I am simply saying," Nell said, softer now, "that he is worth the risk, if that is something you are weighing." She was weighing it. She had been weighing it for weeks. She had been on one side of the scale, and on the other side was everything that had gone wrong in the last 3 years. Every vulnerability and embarrassment and loss. The ghost of Thomas, the shadow of Gerald Pryor, the 3 years of careful quietness that had kept her intact but had also kept her sealed off from anything that resembled connection. The trouble with being sealed off from connection was that it worked too well. She was safe. She was also alone in a way that was beginning to press on her the way the heat pressed on the valley, constant and inescapable. Nell and Diego left after 5 days. Nell hugged Sadie at the stage stop and said, very quietly in her ear, "Be brave, Sadie." And Diego shook her hand with his warm, open smile and said, "Thank you for taking such good care of the house and of him." And Sadie watched the stage pull away and stood in the early September light feeling something inside her shift, some dial turning slightly towards something she had been refusing to name. It was a Thursday in the second week of September when it happened, not the crying in the yard that had already happened, but what came after it, the beginning of the rest. The evening was cool for the first time in months, a suggestion of autumn in the desert air, and Sadie had made a proper roast with root vegetables and was feeling, for no particular reason, almost dangerously close to content. She was sitting on the back porch after the supper things were done, watching the last of the light leave the sky, and she heard the door open and Clement came out and stood leaning on the porch railing not far from her. They were quiet for a while in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was not the absence of communication but a form of it. Then he said, "I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." She looked at him. The last light was going pink and orange behind the mesas. "You have been here since March," he said. "That is 6 months, and in those 6 months this house has been what it has not been in a very long time, which is a home." He paused. He turned the brim of his hat in his hands. "I know you had a life before this. I know you have grief in you that is yours and not mine to ask about. I know you did not come here looking for another pause," and she could see him finding the exact right word, anything beyond what was advertised. He looked at her now. "But I find that I do not want you to leave," he said. "Not in the way an employer means that, in the other way. The way that means I would like you to stay not because I need a housekeeper but because He stopped. He pressed his lips together. He was not a man who performed emotion, and watching him work through it was more affecting than any practiced speech could have been. "Because I would very much like to know you for the rest of my life," he said finally, "if you were willing." Sadie had known, somewhere below the surface, that this was coming. She had been aware of the direction of things for weeks. But hearing it said in his plain, serious, careful voice, in the cooling evening air with the desert going purple around them, was still enough to take her breath. She was quiet for a moment. She was being honest with herself in the few seconds she had, going through all the objections she had been maintaining, the practicality of her position, the newness of all of this, the way she had failed to properly grieve Thomas, the way she had run from her last situation and was possibly still running. And then she thought about Nell's voice saying, "Be brave." And she thought about the day in the yard when he had stood with her while she came apart and had not moved away. And she thought about what she had felt that morning in May when they had hung sheets and fixed the fence post in a silence that had felt more intimate than most conversations she had ever had. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was 30 years old and she had been quiet about everything for 3 years, and that Clement Bailey was worth the risk of speaking. "I need to tell you something first," she said. He waited. She told him about Gerald Pryor. Not just the letter which he had read, but the full account, the way Pryor had begun his attention shortly after Thomas died, the way it had built slowly into something she had not been able to name as threat and could not dismiss as nothing, the way she had finally gone to the church women and then left Wichita inside of a week because she had been afraid and exhausted and had seen no other way. She told him that she had felt like a coward for running, that it had lodged in her like a splinter she could not reach, the sense that she should have stood her ground and could not find the ground firm enough beneath her feet to stand on. Clement listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, he said, "You were not a coward. You removed yourself from a situation that had no good resolution. That is not cowardice, that is sense." "It did not feel like sense," she said. "It felt like defeat." "Things that take courage often feel like defeat in the moment," he said, "because they cost you something. Leaving Wichita cost you the life you had built there. That is a real loss. Feeling it as defeat is just feeling it true." She looked at him for a long time. "Clement," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt the weight of it and the rightness of it at the same time. "Yes," he said. "I would like to stay," she said. In the other way. Something happened to his face that she had never seen before. It was not a large change. It was the slight release of a tension that she had not fully recognized was there until it went, something around his eyes and his jaw that had been held carefully and was now quietly let go. He reached out and took her hand, properly this time, fingers lacing through hers. "All right," he said. They sat on the back porch while the stars came out over the desert, holding hands in the way of two people who have arrived somewhere very specific after a very long road, and neither of them needed to say anything more that evening. The courtship, if that was the word for it, though it felt too formal a word for what was essentially an intensification of what had already been happening, proceeded through the autumn with the kind of careful, warm thoroughness that was characteristic of both of them. There were walks in the early evening when the heat relented. There were long kitchen table conversations that went later and later into the night. There were moments of an almost unbearable sweetness, a hand offered crossing rough ground, a shared look across the supper table that lasted a beat longer than necessary. The evening Sadie was reading by lamplight and looked up to find him watching her with an expression of such open and uncomplicated warmth that she had to look back down at her book for a moment just to recover herself. He told her things he had not told anyone, including Nell. About the year after his father died, when he had nearly lost the ranch to a combination of bad weather and his own inexperience. About the neighboring rancher who had tried to buy him out at below market value during that lean period, counting on Clement's desperation. And about the grim satisfaction of having refused and scraped through and built the place into what it was now. About the loneliness of it, of having built something and having no one to build it for. She told him more about Thomas, and about her childhood, and about the farm in Kansas, and about her parents, both gone before Thomas died, and about the way it had felt in the boarding house years, doing work that was adequate but that fitted her the way clothes made for someone else fit, passably but never quite right. "This fits," she said one evening, meaning the ranch, meaning the work, meaning all of it. And then she looked at him and said more quietly, "You fit." The evening she said that, he stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her face in his hands and kissed her, once, carefully and completely, in the way of a man who does not do things halfway. And she put her hands over his hands and kissed him back. And that was the end of the careful, comfortable distance they had maintained, and the beginning of something that was at once less safe and considerably more true. In November, Buck pulled her aside one afternoon while she was hanging the washing, which had become her exclusive territory since she had made it clear in July that the washing line was under her management. Buck looked at her for a moment with his weathered, quiet eyes and said, "He is going to ask you a question, soon. I thought you might want to be prepared." She looked at him. "Buck." "I have known that boy since he was knee-high," Buck said, with the dignity of a man delivering information he considers important, "and I have never seen him like this. I just wanted you to know that anyone who has been around him long enough to understand what he is worth, they would tell you yes." He tipped his hat and went back to the paddock before she could respond, and she stood there with a wet shirt in her hands and her heart doing something disruptive in her chest. Clement asked her on the first Sunday in December. He did not make a production of it. He had never been a man for production. They had gone to the Sunday service in town, which they had begun doing together in October, and afterward he had driven the wagon out along the South Road for a little way, to a spot where the mesa caught the winter light in a particular way he had always liked. He stopped the wagon and they sat looking at it for a moment, the clean white-yellow light on the red rock, the cold blue sky above. He reached inside his coat and brought out a ring, small and plain and gold, and held it in his palm. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you will have me. I cannot promise it will always be easy. I can promise that I will never leave you standing alone in it, whatever it is." He looked at her. "I have been alone in things for a long time. I do not want that anymore. I want it to be us." She had been preparing to be moved by this. She had known it was coming, had been knowing for weeks, and she had thought she could receive it gracefully and composedly. But the last sentence, "I want it to be us," said in his plain, careful voice, hit her squarely in the center of the chest, and she felt her eyes fill. "Yes," she said, without any of the composed grace she had planned. "Yes, Clement." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she turned to him on the wagon seat and kissed him with the full force of everything she had been carrying for months. And he kissed her back with an ardor that was entirely at odds with his carefully maintained quietness, and that told her things about him that she found deeply satisfying. And then they sat in the winter light with her hand in his and the mesa glowing around them. And she thought that this was what it felt like when something was right all the way down. When the fit was not just adequate but true. They were married in the Beaumont Flats church on the second Saturday of January, 1885, which was a cold, bright day that the whole town apparently considered a public event given how many people showed up. The preacher who came once a month had been notified in advance and was present and official. Nell arrived from Socorro with Diego the day before, and she swept into the ranch house and promptly burst into tears and hugged Sadie so hard that Sadie had to ask her to please be careful with the dress. The dress was a matter of some negotiation. Sadie had one decent gray dress that she had considered appropriate for a January wedding in a territorial church, and Nell had looked at it and said, simply, no. The result of this was a collaboration involving Nell's considerable creative energy and Sadie's considerable sewing skill, and a bolt of deep blue wool serge from the general store. And the outcome was a dress that was not showy but was exactly right, fitted and warm and blue as the winter sky. And when Sadie came down the hall in it on the morning of the wedding and Clement saw her from the parlor doorway, he stood very still for a moment in the way he sometimes did when something landed hard. And then he said, "You look beautiful," which was the longest personal compliment he had ever paid her, and she felt it from the top of her head to the soles of her boots. The ceremony was straightforward and serious, as suited both of them. Nell cried. Diego put his arm around Nell. Buck stood in the front pew with his arms folded and his eyebrows at neutral, which for Buck indicated maximum emotional engagement. Hector and Will sat beside him, and Will had clearly been coached by Hector not to grin too broadly, but was losing the battle significantly. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," and Clement kissed her in front of the whole congregation with a quiet and deliberate tenderness that was both entirely him and entirely enough to make several of the women in the church reach for their handkerchiefs, Sadie thought about the yard in the blazing July sun, and the letter in the dirt, and his hand on hers, and the sound she had made that she had been so sure she could hold in forever. She was glad she had not been able to hold it in. She was glad he had been there to see it. The first year of their marriage was full in the way that good things are full. The ranch work expanded in the spring of 1885, when Clement secured a grazing lease on an additional 300 acres to the east, which had been a goal of his since before she arrived, and which happened partly because of a conversation she had facilitated between him and the family who owned the land, the Delacroix family, whose matriarch Sadie had befriended at Sunday services, and who had trusted Sadie's account of Clement's character enough to sit down and discuss terms. When the lease was signed, Clement looked at her across the supper table and said, "That would not have happened without you," and she said, "You did the negotiating," and he said, "You gave me the door." She had started to understand him better by then, the way he thought about things, the way he valued them. He was not a man who spoke gratitude frequently or dramatically, but he was consistent and specific with it, which she had come to understand was more meaningful than effusiveness. He noticed what she did. He said so. He included her in decisions about the ranch in ways that she had not expected, and that she had come to realize reflected his genuine respect for her judgment, not a performance of modern sentiment but a practical acknowledgement that she was intelligent and perceptive and worth consulting. In the late spring of 1885, she told him she was expecting. She had been sitting with the knowledge for 3 days before she said it, not from fear exactly but from a kind of stunned wonder at the fact of it, the way the future had arrived in this very particular form and was waiting to be acknowledged. She told him at breakfast, sitting across the table from him, and she watched his face go through something she had never seen on it before, a rapid sequence of emotions that included, she thought, surprise, and then something very profound and quiet that settled over his features like sunrise. He set down his coffee. He reached across the table and took her hands. He said nothing for a moment, and she understood that he was processing it in the way he processed all important things from the inside out, and she waited. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I am very well," she said. "And you are?" He searched for the word again in that way he had, glad. She felt tears prick her eyes, not grief this time, not the old held-in grief, but something that was almost its opposite, a fullness that had nowhere to go but out. "I am so glad," she said. He got up from the table and came to her and pulled her gently to her feet and held her very carefully, as though she had become suddenly precious, which she had to laugh at a little. And she told him she was expecting a child not made of glass, and he said, "I know," and held her just as carefully anyway. The baby was born in the second week of January, 1886, almost exactly a year after the wedding, which Nell took as a cosmically organized event and which Sadie attributed to slightly more practical causes. It was a boy. Clement held him in the kitchen in the early morning, after the worst of it was over, and the midwife who had come from town had cleaned things up and made tea, and the house was quiet. And he stood by the window holding his son with an expression of such complete and unguarded wonder that Sadie, lying in the bed exhausted and wrung out and thoroughly alive, watched him and felt something settle in her so completely that she thought perhaps this was what it was supposed to feel like, this sense of having arrived. Not just at a place but in herself. They named him James after Clement's father. Buck, when told, lost the battle with his eyebrows completely for the first time Sadie had ever witnessed, and they went all the way up his forehead, and he said, "Good," in the voice of a man who considers the world correctly arranged at last. Nell came from Socorro with Diego and stayed for 2 weeks and was magnificent, taking charge of the household with the efficiency of a small general, so that Sadie could rest and Clement could work without worrying. And Diego and Clement spent hours on the porch in the evenings talking in the low, easy way of men who have become brothers by something better than blood, which is choice. Gerald Pryor never came to Beaumont Flats. The letter Clement had sent had done what Clement had said it would do, which was to establish clearly that the situation he had counted on, a woman alone and without resources, no longer existed, and that there was therefore no particular lever to press. Men like Pryor, Sadie had come to understand, were not persistent when persistence stopped paying. They moved on to easier calculations. She did not spend much time thinking about him after that. He had been a shadow in the story of her life, and now he was not even that. In the spring of 1886, a situation arose on the neighboring Callaway spread that required Clement's careful navigation. Old Henry Callaway had died in the winter, leaving his ranch to his 2 sons, who promptly fell into a dispute about ownership that had the potential to spill over property lines and affect water access for several ranches, including the Bailey land. Clement had been approached by 3 different neighbors to serve as an informal mediator, a role he had not sought, but that reflected the community's understanding of his judgment. He talked to Sadie about it over several evenings, working through the details with her in the kitchen, using her as a sounding board in the way he had developed. And she had made a suggestion about a particular aspect of the water rights negotiation that had not occurred to him, and that turned out to be the linchpin of the eventual resolution. The Callaway brothers had signed an agreement by April that everyone found fair, and Henry Callaway's lawyer, a man named Amos Bright who had ridden up from Santa Fe, had looked at Sadie during the signing dinner and said to Clement, "Your wife has an excellent legal mind," and Clement had said, without any particular surprise in his voice, "Yes, she does." She had turned that over in her mind for days afterward, the fact that it had not surprised him. The fact that he had simply agreed, as if her having a good mind was the same category of unremarkable fact as the ranch needing water. She had spent so much time in her previous years being invisible, having the things she noticed and the things she understood slide past the people around her without acknowledgement, that being seen so plainly and so consistently by him still surprised her at unexpected moments. She had thought when she came to Beaumont Flats that she was just surviving. She had not known that she was also, somewhere under all that survival, waiting to be seen. He saw her. He had seen her from the first, in that quiet, attentive way of his, the way he had noticed her rubbing her thumb at the sink and given her the room to carry it, the way he had noticed the shape of her quiet before he ever knew what it contained. She had worn her grief so quietly for so long that his noticing it without words had undone her completely. And being completely undone, it turned out, was not the disaster she had always feared. It was the beginning. James was walking and talking in the determinedly willful way of toddlers by the spring of 1887, and the ranch had grown enough that Clement had brought on a fourth hand, a serious young man of 20 named Archero, who was Hector's cousin, and who had Hector's easy competence, and none of his easy conversation, fitting into the Bailey ranch culture with seamless quietness. Life had found its rhythm in the way that good lives do, not the flat repetition of trapped things, but the rolling, varied rhythm of something alive and purposeful. The days had texture and meaning. The hard work was hard, and the quiet evenings were quiet, and the good moments were very good, sharply present in a way that Sadie had not allowed herself in years, because allowing yourself to be present in good moments meant also allowing yourself to be fully present in loss, and she had not been willing to pay that price. She was willing now. She knew Thomas was in her still, not as an absence but as a part of what had shaped her, and she had found that she could hold that without it diminishing what she had with Clement, because they were two different loves that did not compete, one a thing that had been and had mattered absolutely, the other a thing that was, and that she was building day by day with her whole heart. Clement had never asked her to choose between them, had never shown so much as a shadow of competition with Thomas's memory, and she thought that this generosity, more than almost anything else, told her everything true about who he was. One evening in the summer of 1887, when James was 18 months old and asleep in the back room, and the evening was warm enough to sit outside and the sky was the impossible starred dark of the desert at night, Clement said to her, "Do you remember when I asked you to stay in the other way?" She looked at him over the porch railing. "I remember. I said I would like to know you for the rest of my life," he said. "I meant it then. I want you to know that it turns out that knowing you is," he paused in the way he always did, finding the exact right word, "the best thing. Not the best thing that has happened to me. The best thing, full stop. The best thing the way the sky was the sky, and the land was the land, fundamental and without qualification." She reached over and put her hand over his on the railing, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat together in the warm desert dark, and she thought about the woman who had gotten off the stage in Beaumont Flats in the spring of 1884 with one carpet bag, and a name on a folded piece of paper, and 3 years of carefully contained grief, and she felt for that woman a tenderness she had not been able to feel at the time, because at the time all she had been able to do was survive. And sometimes that was what was required, and sometimes the surviving was simply what you did until you found your way to something else. She had found her way to something else. To this. In the autumn of 1887, Nell wrote to say that she was expecting, which led to a 6-week round of letters between the two women of considerable warmth and specificity, comparing symptoms and remedies and the general tyranny of first trimesters in a way that Sadie found more genuinely useful than anything the medical pamphlets offered. The Ramirez baby arrived in March of 1888, a girl they named Concepcion, which Nell reported was for Diego's grandmother, and who was, according to Nell's detailed letters, perfect in every particular. James met his cousin Concepcion that summer when the Ramirezes visited for 2 weeks, and the two 18-month-olds regarded each other with the grave mutual assessment of the very young and the very small, and eventually arrived at a working relationship that primarily involved James bringing Concepcion rocks, which she accepted with discernment. Hector was married that same summer to a woman named Rosa Delgado from Albuquerque, a match that had developed over 2 years of careful correspondence and a series of visits, and Sadie attended the wedding in Beaumont Flats and danced with Clement in the street outside the church, while the fiddle player from El Paso played something fast and bright, and Clement danced with the conservative, careful formality of a man who is not entirely sure his body is doing what he is telling it to. And she laughed until her sides hurt, and he said, without much dignity but with a great deal of warmth, "I am aware that I am not good at this." And she said, "You are perfect at this," and kissed him in the street while Buck looked the other way with great deliberateness, and Will cheered and Hector and Rosa laughed from the doorway. The second pregnancy came in the spring of 1889, and this time Sadie was more prepared, and Clement was more prepared, and they had 3-year-old James to manage through it, who was at this point a compact, serious child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's observational quality, and a genuine passion for the horses in the paddock that suggested his future occupation was not going to be a surprise. The second baby was a girl, born in December of 1889, and they named her Clara, which was the name of Sadie's mother. Clement had suggested it, which Sadie had not expected, and when she had looked at him with the question in her eyes, he had said, "She should carry something of yours forward," and she had needed a moment before she could speak. Clara was different from James from the very first day, louder and more mobile and entirely determined about everything, and James regarded his new sister with the same careful assessment he had applied to his cousin Concepcion, and eventually reached the conclusion that she was acceptable, which was about the warmest endorsement he gave anything other than horses. By 1891, the Bailey Ranch was one of the most respected operations in the territory. The additional grazing lease had proved to be the right investment, and the herd was strong and the land was well managed, and the reputation Clement had built, through decades of straightforward dealing and consistent quality, was the kind that opened doors in Albuquerque and Santa Fe that stayed closed for less careful men. But what Sadie was most aware of, in the daily texture of those years, was not the success in any external sense. It was the quality of the ordinary. The breakfast table conversations. The way James would come in from the paddock every morning to tell her about the horses with a seriousness that she found both endearing and hilarious. The way Clara said things with an absolute directness that occasionally stopped the entire household in its tracks. The way Clement came in at the end of a long day, and the house changed quality, became more settled, became itself more fully, and she understood that she was part of what made that happen for him, and he was part of what made that happen for her, and that this was what people actually meant, when they talked about home. Will married in 1891, a girl from the town named Alice Marsh, and the wedding was held in the same white church where Clement and Sadie had married 6 years earlier. Alice was a practical, warm young woman who took immediately to ranch life and to Sadie, and the two of them developed a friendship that added another thread to the fabric of Sadie's life in Beaumont Flats. Buck showed no signs of retiring and no signs of marrying, and seemed entirely satisfied with the role he had occupied for decades, which was the steady, weathered anchor of the Bailey operation. And Sadie had long since understood that his particular form of devotion to the family was as real as any formal bond, and that he was in every practical sense part of the household, however he might resist having that articulated. She said it to him once directly in the fall of 1892, when he had been ill for a week with something that turned out to be less serious than it had initially appeared, but that had frightened her considerably. When he was recovered and back on his feet and grumbling about everyone making too much of it, she said to him in the kitchen, "You are family, Buck. I want you to know that we know that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know it," in a voice that suggested he had known it for a long time and was glad to have it said. James turned 7 in January 1893, and he had by this point declared with complete certainty that he was going to be a horse breeder, a declaration that neither of his parents found surprising, and Clement had begun teaching him the specific elements of horse evaluation with an earnestness that matched James's own, the two of them in the paddock on weekend mornings, with a gravity that Sadie watched from the kitchen window with a warmth she could not fully contain. She had a conversation that spring with Clement about the future of the ranch, about what he wanted it to be in 10 years and 20, and he said, "I want it to be the kind of place that is worth handing on." And she said, "I think it already is." And he said, "Then I want to make it more worth handing on," which was such a precise expression of everything she had come to understand about him that she wanted to write it down. She had started writing things down in the last few years. Not a journal exactly, or not a formal one, but a habit of putting things on paper that she wanted to keep. Conversations, observations, small moments. She filled 3 notebooks over the following years, and Clement knew about them and never asked to read them, which was one of the things she loved about him, the consistent respect for the parts of her that were hers alone, even as they had made so much of their lives together. In the summer of 1893, a letter came from a woman in Kansas who had known Sadie's mother, an older woman named Mrs. Pauling, who was settling the final affairs of an estate, and who had located a small sum of money that had been saved by Sadie's mother before she died, and that had been in the hands of a cousin who had only recently been found. The sum was not large, but it was real and it was hers, and it was a piece of her past that she had not expected to recover. She told Clement about it over supper, and he said, practically and immediately, "What do you want to do with it?" She had thought about it for a week. She had thought about necessity and sense and investment. Then she said, "There is a family in the far south of town, the Morales family, who are trying to buy a small parcel of land and are short a specific amount. I would like to give it to them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." No elaboration, no argument, no questions about practicality, just yes. She looked at him across the table and thought about all the ways he had said yes to her, directly and indirectly, through all the years. Yes to her judgment, yes to her grief, yes to her strength, yes to her history, to Thomas's memory, to everything she had come to him carrying. Yes to her exactly as she was. "Clement," she said. "Yes," he said again, and looked at her with those gray eyes that had always seen more than they let on. "I love you very much," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and he said, "I love you. I have loved you since you came in from that yard in the summer and cried in front of me for the first time, because before that you were so steady and so careful that I could admire you without being completely finished, and after that I was completely finished." She stared at him. He looked slightly as though he had said more than he intended, and then he looked at her squarely and did not take it back. She got up from her side of the table and went around to his side and sat down next to him, and took his face in her hands the way he had taken hers on a September evening 8 years ago. And she kissed him, and he kissed her back. And in the other room they could hear James explaining something about horses to Clara with great authority, and Clara's voice arguing back with her usual conviction. And the house was warm and full and thoroughly itself. And outside the desert was going golden in the late afternoon light, the same red mesas, the same wide sky, the same land that had been here before either of them arrived and would be here after, but that held, right now, in this kitchen, in this moment, everything that mattered. In the fall of 1893, Nell's second child arrived, a boy they named Ezekiel, and Nell's letter describing the event was so characteristically detailed and dramatic and loving that Sadie read parts of it aloud to Clement over breakfast, and they both laughed. And she wrote back a letter that matched Nell's warmth measure for measure, because this was what she had learned, or rather relearned, over the 9 years since she had arrived in Beaumont Flats. That warmth was not a finite resource, that opening to one person did not diminish what you had for others, that the heart's capacity was not fixed but growing, that love did not compete with love. She had come to this territory sealed up tight against the world, and the world had been patient with her. He had been patient with her. The following spring, when the territory was beginning its annual transformation from winter brown to the tentative green that the desert managed for those few brief weeks before the heat arrived again, Sadie stood at the kitchen window in the early morning with her coffee, watching the light come up over the mesas. James was still asleep. Clara was still asleep. Clement had already gone out to the paddock, and she could see him there, at the fence rail with Copperhead's successor, a bay horse named Red too, who had inherited something of the original Copperhead's temperament and all of his personality. And Clement was doing the thing she had seen him do for a decade now, standing still and breathing slowly near a horse that needed him too. And the horse was settling the way horses did around him. She thought about that morning in March of 1884 when she had stepped off the stage with her carpet bag and her trunk and her folded piece of paper, and about how impossibly far away that morning felt, and how close, the way all important beginnings feel when you are standing inside the life they made. She thought about the letter in the dirt. She thought about the sound she had made that she had been sure she could hold forever. She thought about his hand on hers just there, not gripping, not pulling, just present. She went outside into the cool spring morning and walked across the yard to the paddock, and he heard her coming and turned, and she came to stand beside him at the fence rail, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood together watching the sun come fully up over the mesas, the light going from pink to gold to the clear high white of desert morning, and Red too accepted their presence with the calm of a horse who had always had people worth accepting around him. Sadie set her hand over Clement's where it rested on her shoulder. She felt him press her slightly closer. Neither of them said anything at all, because neither of them needed to, and the silence between them was not the old silence, not the silence of grief sealed inside discipline, not the silence of a woman who had taught herself not to need anyone to witness her pain. It was something entirely different. It was the silence of two people who had arrived, finally and completely at the same place, who had built something together that was sturdy and true and theirs, who had chosen each other out of clarity rather than desperation, and had kept on choosing, day after day, year after year, in the small and ordinary and extraordinary ways that love is actually made. It was the silence of home. And she wore it for the first time in her life, not quietly but fully, not as armor but as what it was, as joy, as belonging, as the particular piece of a woman who had found her way through grief to something she had not known she was going to find and had been given the grace to recognize it when she did. The sun climbed. The desert opened. The day began. It was, as all their days were, good.